I've talked about that song probably the whole 5 years that I've been here, because it is one of my all-time favorite songs. And if I had to pick just one song, perhaps, that was one that I just love the most, that definitely is one of them. Maybe the most important one to me. And I'm glad we finally now have it accessible in our songbook. It wasn't in our previous songbook, and of course we got it on the screen too. And I didn't realize it till we started singing it that hey, we've got that song now. And I think it's probably actually even appropriate. David and I didn't communicate on this. We have before, and sometimes we just get lucky, and today is one of those days. The message of that song actually probably fits a little well with how I wanted us to kind of start off this morning, because this is the last Sunday of this year. And all throughout this year, we have had a number of different themes that we've been focusing on. And we did it different. In the past, whenever I've done a series, I would usually do it every Sunday morning for a month or 6 weeks or something like that. And in planning for this year, I'm going to try something a little bit different. Because if you're like me, it's easy to focus on whatever the series is for those 4 or 6 weeks. And then 2 weeks later, we've forgotten, we've moved on, other things to take our attention, and those things get farther from us the farther we get from them in time. So I wanted to try something a little bit different this year that would help to remind us over and over and over throughout the whole year. One of those was a focus on prayer. We wanted 2019 to be a year where our prayer lives improved and increased, whatever that would look like for you, because for each one of us, it would likely look a little bit differently. You might not want to say it in front of everybody at church, but some of you are thinking it and know in your heart that this is true. You don't ever pray. And maybe when 2019 came up and we started talking about prayer, your thought was, I don't really pray much. And if I do, it's kind of very quick and hurried and random and maybe in difficult situations, and I just don't have much of a prayer life. And so if that was where you started, our goal for 2019 was this, that you would begin to pray more regularly. Didn't have a set goal of 3 times a day or 5 days a week or anything. Just wherever you are, if it's not something you do, want it to be something that you've started doing. For others, it might be, well, I pray regularly. I pray every day. I maybe pray before my meals or pray before bedtime or before I leave my bed in the morning. But admittedly, my prayers are kind of shallow. They're not deep. They're not intense. They're not the opening and pouring out of the heart. In fact, if you listen to me pray every day for a month, there probably wouldn't be much deviation from one day to the next. You would probably get my prayer memorized quickly and be able to pray it for me. And so our goal, if that described how your prayer life functioned, was that your prayer life would get deeper than just the surface normalities and niceties, and get down there in the heart a little bit and become a little more spontaneous and a little more unpredictable. If you were someone who already had a pretty strong prayer life and your prayers were varied and that what I've described didn't really fit for you, we wanted you to be able to go even deeper into where it became perhaps your greatest spiritual strength. We all have different spiritual gifts and abilities and things that come more naturally for one than for another. I don't mind telling you, I'm not proud of it, but it's just the way the Lord put me together. Prayer is not something that it comes natural to me. It's not a natural strength that I have. You give me a word from the Bible, I'll talk to you all day. But you ask me to sit down and talk to God, it takes some prep work for me. I got to get my head right in order to be able to pray really sincerely and from the heart and in depth, other than just the surface stuff. So I know this is something I struggle with. I know that there are other people who struggle with it as well. So we've been together on this journey to try and transform our prayer life this year. I know mine has changed. It's still not where it wants to be. I still have much, much higher aspirations. But I can honestly say I'm better off in December than I was in January. And so we did this every month, so that as we get about 4 weeks away from the last lesson on prayer and we start to forget and we start to slip back into our old habits, which we have established over a long period and are easy to do, then here comes another sermon on prayer to kind of remind and refocus us. And so I really appreciate David leading that song. It just works out well. But this is going to be the last reminder at least for now. We're not planning on continuing it necessarily in 2020, but we probably will revisit it. Now, the scripture you see on the screen comes from 1 Thessalonians 5:17. And interesting, those two books, 1 and 2 Thessalonians, very short books. And it's fitting that they're short because they were written to a church that Paul only got to spend a short amount of time with. The best we can tell, Paul probably was with this church for about 3 weeks before he had to leave. And he had to leave because if he didn't, he was probably going to die. And chances are the other believers who lived there in Thessalonica were likely going to die as well. And so they wanted Paul, we don't want you to go, but you've got to go. You've got to go. Now, can you imagine if you're Paul, how hard it would be as a church planter? I mean, keep in mind, you came into this city, you preached the gospel, you baptized some folks, and 3 weeks later, now keep in mind, he didn't go to a church that already existed. He didn't come to a Lake City where there's 150 people, hold a gospel meeting and baptize 10 people, and then leave at the end of the week and go, hey, they've got elders, they've got Sunday school teachers, they've got a lot of brothers and sisters, they're going to be okay. No, Paul came into a place where there was no church. And when he left, there was a church. And they were a whole whopping 3 weeks old. Would you want to walk away from those new believers? Can't imagine how hard that was. And Paul was terrified that especially because they were under constant persecution. If you read 1 and 2 Thessalonians, the key theme in those two letters is you're suffering, I know it. And it's probably going to get worse. And it breaks my heart that I'm not there. And Paul tells them in pretty no uncertain terms, I'm scared that your faith isn't going to be able to stand it. You're a baby Christian and you're being thrown into the fire. I'm scared you're not going to be able to make it. If you were Paul, what would be the one thing that you could do in your absence for this young church? Pray. You think you would pray a lot about it? You think you'd pray every day? You think you'd pray night and day? You think you'd pray continuously and constantly? Keep those words in mind because you're going to see them here again in a few minutes. And it's in these letters, 1 Thessalonians chapter 5 and verse 17. Paul's got this neat little list kind of at the ending. It's almost like he's been writing this stuff, and it's almost like he's having to hurry up and come to an end. Kind of like I've been accused of with my sermons. I spend so much time on the introduction, then I go, oh wow, time's up. I got to hurry up here at the end and say all the good stuff that I really want people to know about the Bible. Well, kind of Paul does that, and he gets to the end of the letter, and he's like, don't quench the spirit. Rejoice evermore. Pray without ceasing. These little quick, short, one-liner statements that he closes out the letter with. And so we get 1 Thessalonians 5:17, pray without ceasing. And ever since then, we as believers have read that verse and go, I don't know what that means, and I'm kind of scared of it. Pray without ceasing. You ever thought, well, how can I do that? Like, for example, right now, I am preaching. I am not praying. I've had to cease from prayer, haven't I? Now, some of y'all are praying for me, I know. Please let this be a short one today. Please, I'm tired. The holidays, we've got to take the tree down. We got all this laundry to do. So it's okay that I'm not praying because you're going to cover for me. But how do I even do that? Okay, well, I got to go to bed sometime, right? Or what about my job requires me to operate heavy machinery, or I work in the medical field, and look, I have literally people's lives in my hand with medicines and procedures. And how am I supposed to pray without ceasing? Because to me, without ceasing means what? Not ceasing, right? Never stop. Well, some of that has to do with just, this as a King James translation, by the way, and we're going to talk about maybe how we would use the word today or the phrase today to understand better what it means. But it doesn't literally mean never stop praying at any moment. That's not even humanly possible. We would say, okay, the goal is to pray without ceasing, but what does that actually look like? What does that look like? And the way we can answer that question, I think, is to first see what does it look like in Paul's writings. Because Paul talks about prayer a lot throughout his epistles, especially in 1 and 2 Thessalonians. So let's look at a little bit about what Paul has to say about it. In his writings, this is what pray without ceasing looked like. We might say pray continually. And you say, well, that's not a whole lot better than pray without ceasing, because pray continually means continually be praying. But that's not exactly what he's saying. He says in Ephesians 6:18, pray always. In Philippians 4, he tells those brothers, they're facing anxiety. Remember, he says, rejoice in the Lord always, verse 4, and again I say rejoice. He goes on to say, be anxious for nothing, but in everything by prayer and supplication, let your requests be made known unto God. In everything, pray. Colossians, he tells to continue in prayer. The Romans, he says, continue instant in prayer. Now, to this church, this is what he's already said before he says pray without ceasing. We thank God without ceasing. Night and day we pray exceedingly. We pray always for you. I think it's pretty clear when you look at the way Paul talks about prayer. He doesn't mean literally at every moment pray, but at every moment be ready to pray. Maybe we would say it like this. Prayer is always appropriate. Whatever the setting, whatever the situation, whatever the time, prayer is always appropriate. Prayer is always a good idea. I think maybe we would understand it better if we talked about it like this. If I were to say to you, hey, you want to go fishing today? Some people would say, man, I'm always up for fishing. I'm always ready to go fishing. Hey, you got lunch plans? Have you eaten yet? Man, I can always eat. You understand what that means, right? It's something that I enjoy. It's something that I love. It's something that, look, it doesn't take much convincing. It doesn't have to even be convenient. If you suggest it, that's a good time for me. When's a good time to eat? Now. I've got a t-shirt. It's a New Orleans slogan that says, let's get lunch and talk about dinner. You ever do that? You ever find yourself sitting at one meal talking about what you're going to do for the next meal? Okay, that's pray without ceasing. It's always there. It's always at the front of the mind. It's always at the tip of the tongue. Any moment is always a good moment. Any circumstance always triggers it. That's where Paul wants us. He wants us to be people. Think of a mousetrap that is set, and how little agitation it takes to set it off. Paul wants our prayer posture to be like that mousetrap. The slightest little thing, good or bad, comforting or frightening, joyful or discouraging, whatever it is, that it triggers a response of prayer in us. Now, if you've been with us throughout this whole journey this year, you know that every prayer doesn't have to be like Jesus' prayers. Jesus was a fervent prayer. Do you remember when he took the disciples into the garden with him? We get deceived a little bit because here's what Matthew says. He went a little bit further. He fell on his face and he said, Father, let this cup pass from me. Nevertheless, not my will, but yours be done. And then he comes back to the apostles and he sees Peter, James, and John asleep. And you remember what he said to them? Could you not pray with me 1 hour? Now, here's what I don't know. Did Jesus say a lot more in that prayer that Matthew didn't record? Or did Jesus just repeat that same request, that same prayer over and over and over for an hour? I don't know. But I know Jesus did that on 3 occasions, didn't he? Every prayer doesn't have to be an hour long. Matter of fact, if you're leading the closing prayer today, we used to say something when I was in preaching school, when one guy would get up and pray for 30 minutes before we could leave and go and say, hey, look, you may need to catch up on your praying, but we're all caught up. You do that at home, okay? We're good. When you get home, you catch up. It doesn't have to be an hour long. That's not Paul's point. It's not about length or depth or any of that. I'm always in a posture of prayer. It might be a one-word prayer. It might be a sentence prayer. It might be an hour prayer. It might be an all-night prayer. The point is, it's the posture of the heart. And what Paul is saying is, I know that we have different postures in different cultures. In our culture, most commonly, this is how we pray. You know, you might do this. You don't really see people do that much anymore, except little children. You might see the folding of the hands. You don't even see that a lot anymore. Mostly what you see is a bowing of the head and a closing of the eyes. Now, if we were in the New Testament, it was probably very, very different. Their prayer posture typically was more like this. This was the posture that the Jewish people tended to do in their prayers. And I think it's a beautiful posture, by the way, because to me, it physiologically, it almost resembles a child reaching for their parent. You know, you see little ones do this all the time. They walk up to mama or daddy and they do this. I need you to pick me up. I need to be near you. I need you to fix it. I need you to help me, whatever it is. And so I like that posture. And that probably has a little bit to do behind with what Paul says in 1 Timothy when he talks about, I would that men pray everywhere, lifting up holy hands. I think what he's telling them is this: your posture should not just be this, but the hands that you lift up. I think it's a callback to Isaiah chapter 1. Because in Isaiah chapter 1, they were lifting up hands before God in their prayer and their worship, but their hands were stained with blood, God said. And so he said, you need to wash and make yourself clean. And then I will bless you. And so I think Paul's kind of tying their posture of the day, which was to pray like this, and say, look, don't just lift up your hands. Make sure those hands are holy, that they're sanctified, that they're purified. In other words, the life should match the posture. We've talked about that a lot this year. Now, something you don't see much anymore, those of you over there, you're just not going to be able to see me do this, unless it's Tim Tebow, is this. You don't see this posture much anymore. Now, in days of old, it was a very common posture. People did not pray without getting down on their knees. And again, you can see it's a very visual image of submission. When you get down on your knees in front of someone, you are humbling yourself significantly. Some will even, I've seen people literally lay out prostrate on the ground, flat on their face. The idea is I'm getting as low as I can physically so that the posture of my heart can match that. I want to humble myself in the sight of the Lord. I know whose presence I'm coming into. I heard a story one time about a visiting preacher who had that practice of kneeling before prayer. And during prayer, and he was in the pulpit, and for whatever reason, he asked one of the brothers in the audience to lead in prayer. And so when the brother started leading in prayer, he did what he always does, and he kneeled. Well, the problem was the brother in the audience didn't pray very loud. So he bows down for the prayer, and the prayer only lasted about 30 seconds. And about 3 minutes later, they see him poking his head around the pulpit because he didn't know the guy had stopped praying. So maybe that's not a good posture in public assembly. Maybe keep that one at home for safety purposes. But listen, Paul's not addressing the posture of our prayer, but the posture of our heart. And here's what he's saying. Whether it's lifting up hands or bowing the head or kneeling or laying it, the heart should always be in the posture of prayer. It should always be there. And when the heart is always in the posture of prayer, guess what comes next? Prayer comes naturally. Prayer comes naturally. So he's calling on them, pray without ceasing, always in every situation. I'm always up for it. I'm always ready to. My heart is always in the posture of prayer. Now, in the time we got left, I'll just do a couple of suggestions for things that we can do, maybe to help us cultivate that a little bit, to help us get into a posture of prayer more often. And here's one of them I would suggest. We need to continue to pray publicly. Culturally, it has kind of become out of vogue. In fact, you might have been in a situation, I've seen believers be in situations where you're maybe in a restaurant or some other public setting and someone begins to pray. Maybe you're sitting in a restaurant and somebody at a table over starts to pray, and sometimes it can seem a little awkward. Now, there would have been a time when it would have been awkward not to pray before the meal in a public setting. Well, that's not the way things are culturally anymore. As our culture begins to drift more and more away from public displays of religion, generally speaking, religious people have capitulated and become less and less public with their displays of religion. Now, I'm not saying to flaunt it, to thumb our nose in people's faces, to call attention to ourselves intentionally or unnecessarily. I'm not saying try to make a point and make this a political position. I'm not saying all those things. I'm just saying this. If you're a person who prays all the time, then yeah, prayer in public will be something that happens sometimes, because sometimes you're in public and sometimes you're in a situation where you want or need to pray. That might be praying at your meal. I find it funny sometimes that everybody gets up in arms about wanting to get prayer back in school and prayer back in public and stuff like that. Folks, the government cannot ever ban prayer publicly. They can make all the laws that they want, but nobody can stop you from praying anywhere you want to. Now, you may not pray out loud, but I'm going to tell you what, if you're in school, you can bow your head anytime you want to and pray. You may not even bow your head. You might just sit there with a smile on your face and say in a prayer. I've prayed many times with my head up and my eyes open and a smile on my face. And I'm saying, Lord, keep my mouth shut or I will get fired. Lord, help me. Don't let me say what I'm thinking. You know, we can always be in a posture of prayer. And if we want other people, and I'll tell you something that some friends of mine have started doing. At first I thought it was weird, and now I think it's genius. I've got some preacher friends that live around the country, and they have started going usually at least one day a week to a coffee shop, taking their books and their computers and whatnot, setting up in Starbucks or their local coffee shop, and they'll read and do their studying and note-taking and stuff like that there and drink their coffee. But they'll also put out a little placard, like a little thing. This says something along these lines. Is there anything you would like for me to pray for you about, or anything you'd like to talk about? Now, most of them will tell me the same things. For a long time, people just looked at you like you had three heads. What kind of weirdo is this? But if you've frequented coffee shops, you know that a lot of times they have a routine clientele that come in every day at the same time and things like that. And what they discovered is, over time, as they did this week after week after week, same day of the week, same time of the day, that the same people kept coming and showing up. And over time, people began to see, this is not just some strange weirdo. And they would get to talking about other things. And they said, you know what? After time, after a while, people began to come and sit and say, hey, you're a preacher, aren't you? My wife and I, and then they'll fill in the blank. Or my son is about to, and they'll fill in the blank. Or we just found out, and they'll fill in the blank. Would you pray for us? Would you pray with me? Can I talk to you about this? Praying without ceasing means continue to pray publicly. I don't think there's anything shameful in that. In fact, if we're respectful, I think that the overwhelming majority of the population appreciates that. Yes, there is a small vocal minority that will pitch a fit and act a fool and make it seem as if you are some, horrific oppressor and you're forcing your belief. But folks, I spend a lot of time with the public, and most people don't act like that. They act like that on Twitter. They don't act like that in the real world. Most people don't. In fact, most people, I think, appreciate it. I've never had somebody say, can I pray for you about whatever, and I say no. I appreciate the sentiment that somebody is willing to pray for me, and I think most people are like that. And if we continue to pray publicly, let people see that you want to talk about something that tips the hand of who you are. When people see someone with a head bowed in prayer, they pretty well pick up, hey, that's a person of faith. Generally, when I walk through the world, people don't look at me and go, I bet that's a Christian. I can tell by the way he's dressed. I can tell by the way he carries himself. No, but when I have my Bible in my hand and I read it publicly, or if they see me with my head bowed, people, that's a person of faith. Okay? Continue to pray publicly. By the way, don't people do all kind of other awful things publicly and they don't seem to have a problem with it? You know what PDA is, right? Public displays of affection. You ever seen any of that? Yeah. What about talking loudly on the cell phone? You ever been out in public? Yeah, I tell you what, it was a great Christmas this year, man. All the kids were there. And I've seen people clip their nails out in public. Folks, people do all kind of stuff out in public and don't have a problem with it. I'm not going to have a problem praying in public. I'm not going to be a jerk. I'm not going to try to force anything on you. But I'm also not going to change who I am just because of where I am. And sometimes it leads to amazing things. Acts chapter 16, Paul went, he was in Philippi. There's no church there. There's no synagogue there. But there was a place down by the river where people would go on the Sabbath day to pray. And Paul went down there, and you know what he did? He found other people who were down there praying. And they didn't just pray together. When he left that day, there was a church in Philippi for the first time. All started with public prayer. When he got arrested and he winds up in jail there in Philippi, we're told in verses 23 through 25, after he's been beat, he's in the stocks, and about midnight he and Silas, they sang and they prayed, and the text says, and the prisoners heard them. The other folks were listening. When Jesus was on the cross, I know we don't typically think of this as prayer, but he's talking to God. And the first thing that Jesus says on the cross is a public prayer, and he says, Father, forgive them, they know not what they do. The last thing that he says is, Father, into thy hands I commit my spirit. And then he gave up the spirit and died. And you know what was said after that? A Roman soldier, one of the ones who was responsible for this man's very death, witnessed these things, heard these words, and he said, truly, this was the Son of God, some translations say. Others say, truly, this was a righteous man. Public prayer was noticeable. It changed people's thinking and changed people's opinion. It shaped the way they thought. And one of the great failures of modern Christianity is we have reduced prayer to a garnish instead of sustenance. You go out to eat today, you get you a steak, they're probably going to put some little green leafy looking stuff around the edge of it. I don't know why. Nobody eats that mess. It's just decoration. I want the steak. I want the baked potato. That's what tastes good and fills me up. And that's what prayer is meant to be. Not just a garnish on the side every now and then. It's meant to be the sustenance that keeps my relationship with God strong. Something else we can do is we can pray continually, privately. Pray when you want something. That's what Hannah did. We know that story so well. Hannah wanted a child, and she prayed continually for that child. Pray when you don't want something. We talked about Jesus when he was in the garden, and what did he say? Let this cup pass from me. I don't want this. Now, his submissive tone was, your will be done, but I'm asking you, I don't want this. Pray for what you do want. Pray for what you don't want, whatever that might be. And the first two we do pretty easy, but how often do we pursue the third? Pray when you have something to decide. Luke chapter 6, Jesus is about to select out of all of his disciples 12 that are going to wear the name apostle and be unique and special ambassadors for him in his absence. And before he does it, he went away alone and he prayed. He had a big decision to make, and he wasn't going to make it without it being baptized in prayer first. How often do we do that? Decisions that we have to make in life, whatever they might be, how often do we baptize it in prayer first before we make that decision? Pray continually in private. It all comes down to this ultimately. Is your prayer your steering wheel or your spare tire? That's the difference in pray without ceasing and not praying without ceasing. Is it just what I turn to and call on when things go bad and I need an escape? Or is it what I use to get me through every day, every decision, every circumstance of life, because my heart is constantly in a posture of prayer? And for those of you who were praying fervently today, your prayers are answered. 29 minutes and 17 seconds. And I'm at the end of my notes. See, the Lord answers prayer. This will be our last time talking about it this year. But I hope that this isn't the last time that we focus on it. This year and this series was meant to prime the well. But what we've got to continue to doing in 2020 is to continue to keep the posture of prayer flowing. I hope today helped that a little bit. It may be the case that something today that was said made you think about your relationship with Jesus in a way you haven't been thinking about it. It might be that you're thinking, I'm not close to the Lord. I haven't been drawing near to Him. We have become distant, and I want to come back. And I've got some stuff I need to take care of first. I've got to make some things right so that we can be in a right relationship. We would be so happy to pray together today for God's mercy, God's restoration, and God's continued strengthening in your walk. Or maybe you're ready to say publicly, I want Jesus as my Lord. I want God as my spiritual Father. I want to be born again through baptism, and we'll help you do that. If you just come on, we stand and sing.